Hello friends, Tattooedbiker here. Thanks for stopping by. Today I've got two chilling tales of the unexplained to share with you. Each are very different from the other, but I think they make a great combo. Listen to them both and you'll see why. But before we get started, if you like hearing about the strange, mysterious, unexplained, or just downright creepy things in our world, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. It's completely free, and I upload a new video at least 3 times a week. So now, just kick back and enjoy the stories. Number 1. The Janitor. My student submitted the most disturbing living history project I've ever seen. One of my least favorite parts about being a middle school history teacher is the bullshit living history assignments that we give at the end of every school year. Kids are supposed to sit with their grandparents and videotape, voice record, or transcribe their oldest memories for posterity, and for an easy way to bring up their GPA. I've been doing this for 17 years, and when I collected the projects this time around, I assumed they would be as dull, if not duller, than usual. This hadn't been a particularly bright class. So I went home, poured myself a glass of wine, and prepared for a long night of, I only owned 2 pairs of pants when I was your age, and my brother got beat with a newspaper for hitting a baseball into a neighbor's yard. And of course these projects were peppered with innocent old person comments that were so horribly sexist and racist that you just had to laugh. Now, I had a girl in my class whom I will call Olivia. She was pudgy, quiet, and proved herself a consistent B student. I expected her project to be as unremarkable as she was. And perhaps that's why I was so profoundly disturbed by what I witnessed that night. Olivia had submitted 2 discs for some reason, so I began with the one marked interview. My screen hiccuped twice before a grainy image of a living room came into view. The place was a hoarder's hell. Olivia was curled up in an armchair, clutching a notebook and looking like a scared animal. Across from her sat a man with a somber countenance, smoking a cigarette and staring at her expectantly. "Go ahead," a woman's voice whispered from behind the camera. Olivia's owlish eyes flashed towards the screen, and then back to the man. "I am here with my great-uncle Stephen," she began, almost inaudibly. "He is going to tell us about his oldest memories from being in the Army." Great-uncle Stephen looked like he'd rather be in a trench at the moment, but he waited patiently for the questions to begin. Not surprisingly, Olivia read verbatim from the suggested question sheet that I had handed out to the students. He answered her curtly. Once or twice I heard her mother whisper, "Speak up, Olivia," from behind the camera. Just your usual, typical boring shit. So I was intrigued when Olivia set down the notebook and asked, "Did you like being in the Army?" That was totally off script. Great-uncle Stephen emitted a chain smoker's wheeze. "Nope. Glad to get out of my town, though." "Where did you go?" "Balkans." "Uh-huh," she said. I doubted she knew what the Balkans were, and my suspicion was confirmed when she asked, "Was Balkans very different from here?" "Yes." Mom cleared her throat from behind the camera, perhaps encouraging Great-uncle Stephen to be a little more forthcoming. But Olivia seemed genuinely interested. "Uncle Stephen," she asked, "what is your very worst memory from the Army?" The old man crushed his cigarette in the ashtray and then slowly lifted himself out of his chair. "I'll be back," he mumbled. The camera cut off. When the screen flashed back on, everything was the same, except Great Uncle Stephen had several pieces of paper in plastic sleeves laid atop all the crap that was sitting on his coffee table. One he held in his hand. "I was a kid when I enlisted," he said, looking at Olivia. "Your brother's age." Olivia nodded. "I never saw combat. Both of my deployments were to cities in Eastern Europe that had been destroyed by civil wars. Everything was a mess. I felt like a janitor for Ahem," Mom coughed. Great Uncle Stephen sighed and looked at his paper. "My unit was assigned to a school that had been obliterated by all the violence. Broken windows, caved-in rooms, and for some reason, the part that got to me the most was that the school had been like this for years before we got there. No one had lifted a finger to fix it. I saw kids walk by it on their way to go beg for money or whatever shit they did." The camera dipped towards the floor as I heard Mom whisper harshly at Great Uncle Stephen. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but it wasn't hard to imagine. "Do you want to hear this damn story or not?" I heard him bark in response. "Then you better let me tell it how I want." "Mom," Olivia chimed, "please stop interrupting." "Are you presenting this in front of the class?" "No, Mom. We're just handing it in to the teacher." "I'm sure he's heard the word shit before," Great Uncle Stephen contributed helpfully. But regardless of his gruffness, that statement was pretty accurate. The camera was lifted, and after a couple of blurry focus adjustments, the shot was the same as it was before. I'm talking too much anyway," he grumbled. He lifted the piece of paper in his hand close to his face. "In the basement, I found this letter. I didn't know what it said, but I had a buddy of mine translate it. So I'm going to read it now, and then I'll tell you what I saw in that basement." A chill ran down my spine. Mom zoomed in to Great Uncle Stephen and his letter. His palsied hands trembled as he held up the paper. And this is what he read. "Dear Sir, I never loved my country. So many of these skirmishes are born from patriotism, a power struggle for the shards of a once great empire. But I don't care what name my home has on a map. The fighting is senseless, and I stay as far away from it as I can. It wasn't these attacks and disorganized violence that took the lives of my wife and child. It was illness. Mercifully, it happened quickly for the baby. Nadja suffered for longer. I watched in horror, knowing I couldn't do anything for them. My only solace is that I was there for them every step of the way. I stopped going to work one day, and no one came to look after me. I doubt they even noticed I was gone. Since the school was simply across a field, visible from my window, it would have been easy to go for a few hours each day and come home quickly to care for them. But what was the point? All I did was clean floors. I was as useless to the world as I was to my family. I tried to take Nadja to the hospital, but the journey was too long and taxing. I brought her home, and she died that night. After Nadja and the baby were gone, well, I don't remember much. I didn't leave my hovel, barely ate or slept, though many times I thought of taking my own life. Tempting though it was, I felt paralyzed by my own helplessness. The one thing that kept me sane was my radio. I never turned it off once, even though I didn't listen to the words being said. In fact, the channel I got the clearest was in English, I think, which I don't speak a lick of. But the voices, the music, and the true knowledge that life existed beyond this violent city sustained me. I have no idea how long passed before I saw the light of day again. I was dizzy from hunger, so finding food was my priority. My radio came with me, of course. Since I first holed myself up, it has gone everywhere with me. It talks to me as I sleep and as I wake. I don't know what it's saying, but I know that I would die without it. Once I had some water and food. It occurred to me that the only thing I had left to do was go back to work. So I did. The following morning I simply returned to the school where I was a janitor and got back to work. Nobody made a big deal out of it. Like I said, Nadja had been sick for a long time, and those who worked at the school knew it. I appreciate that no one pestered me to come back to work during the hardest days of my life. The teachers never said much to me, but we smiled at each other in the halls, and that mutual respect was perhaps the reason I decided to come back at all. The place had gone to the dogs without me, so I simply grabbed my broom and rags from my closet and set to cleaning. Everyone is grateful to have me back, I know, and the best part is that nobody minds my radio. I bring it with me everywhere and keep the volume low so it doesn't disrupt the students. Nobody's ever complained. In fact, I suspect they like it. The schoolhouse isn't very big, but it does require a lot of maintenance. The floors are always sticky and stained, so I spend most of my time mopping. Kids make messes. I guess that's why I'm still in business. Sometimes I have to move things around to make sure I get every spot on the floor beautiful and clean, but I take pride in that. And the repairs. The school always needs tune-ups here and there, and I'm happy to help. Some days I'm reconstructing a desk that broke as I whistle along with the radio. Other times I handle more serious structural issues. Days when I have work like this, I feel truly instrumental, like a cog in a larger machine. How could this school survive without me? It took me a long time, but I once again feel like I have a purpose. There is a larder behind the school that's full of preserved food in lieu of payment. I'm allowed to take as much as I want. That arrangement's fine. I mean, what would I do with money anyway? I used to bring the food back to my home, just one field away from the school. But when I started sleeping in the basement, nobody seemed to notice. The school is special to me, and I don't want to leave it unguarded. When I'm besieged with memories of my wife and baby, I turn up the volume on the radio to drown out such thoughts. It works for me every time. Except this morning. Because this morning I woke up to silence. I frantically examined the radio to see what had happened. I honestly can't tell you how many days in a row that I've been using it. Did it simply live out its life and die naturally? I've spent the entire day trying to fix it. Most of the time I've been crying. I'm losing my mind without it. I've given myself until sundown. If I can't fix it by then I'm going to take my life. I'm writing this because the starlight is starting to die and I know what my fate will be. I've thought about taking one last walk through the halls of my school and saying goodbye to the students and teachers. I know I'll be missed, but I can't bring myself to leave this room. I can't go anywhere knowing that my radio is dead in here. There's no more tears in me. It feels like I can't catch my breath. I vomited what little food that I had in my stomach and I'm growing dizzy again, like I did after Nadja died. I'm afraid I'm not long for this world. But before I take my life, I've closed the door to this room and stuck a chair beneath the handle. It's the only room in the basement and has a small casement It lets in just enough light for me to see what I'm doing. If anyone is kind enough to come looking for me, they shouldn't be met with this gruesome sight. Perhaps they'll see the door is blocked, smell my rotting body, and then simply forget that I ever existed. But I've placed both my radio and this note outside the door. Kind sir, if you are reading this, I have one humble request. Please fix it. Save my radio. It didn't deserve to die in its sleep, and I'm ashamed that I can't revive it. Now I'm ready to join Nadja and little Ludmilla in heaven. I hope this school can find another janitor who loves it and cares for it the way I do. The hour is now. Please don't forget my radio. Stanislav. When Mom zoomed back out, Olivia had tears in her eyes. Thank you for sharing, Uncle Stephen, Mom said. Her voice choked. I think we have enough. Wait, Olivia chirped. He said there's more. What did you find? Before Great Uncle Stephen could open his mouth, the image disappeared. My jaw dropped. What was it? What did Great Uncle Stephen see? I promptly remembered that there was a second disc. This one was unmarked, but I hoped it contained the rest of the interview. There was no video, only audio. The voice that started up was Olivia's. Hi, Mr. Garrity. I'm sorry about my mom, but she refused to record the rest of what my uncle was saying. But I asked him to continue, and secretly recorded the story as a voice memo on my phone. I remember you said earlier that history is written by the people who win wars. She sucked in a breath and commenced crying. But everyone's history is important, even if they are sad, pathetic people, and even if they never won a single thing in their life. I haven't slept through the night since I finished this project, but you have to hear what my uncle has to say. There were tears in my eyes, too. The sincerity of her words were beautiful. I was also flattered that she remembered some trite phrase that I threw around because it was what my history teachers had said to me. Before I get too sappy over it, the audio began again. Fine, came Mom's frustrated voice. If you want to hear the rest of the story, fine, but this isn't appropriate for a school project. Let me finish, Great Uncle Stephen snapped. If it's too much for you, help yourself to a snack in the kitchen, but Olivia wants to know what happened. I heard her mom mumble something and then walk away. Olivia and her uncle were alone. I imagined her looking at him expectantly. So, did you find the radio? Or did it get ruined when the school got blown up? He rasped, and I heard the distinct click of a lighter. That letter, he began slowly, had a date on it. What date? She inquired. It was dated 2 weeks before we started rebuilding the school. Didn't you say the school had been destroyed like 2 years ago? Yes, replied Great Uncle Stephen. It had been. There was silence as I felt goosebumps on my arms. The images that came to my mind were almost too overwhelming to express, but Great Uncle Stephen put them into words effortlessly. Clearly he had spent his whole life thinking about it. This man, this Stanislav, went to a vandalized, falling apart, bombed-out schoolhouse and cleaned up blood and rubble like it was spilled drinks and dust. He smiled at dead bodies in the hallway and believed that they were smiling back at him because they liked his radio. He moved around corpses so he could sweep the ground under them. The roof was half caved in, so when it rained he must have gotten soaking wet, but was too oblivious to even feel a thing. I could hear Olivia crying steadily. I found the larder that he was talking about. It was all pickled, preserved food that probably tasted like shit. Most of the stuff was moldy. Did you see the dead body? Yes, he answered, hanging from the ceiling, but still amazingly lifelike. He wasn't rotting away. This hadn't happened years ago. Did he look peaceful? She asked, a chord of desperation in her voice. I couldn't tell you. The smell was rank, and his face was blue and his eyes were bulging, like this. I could imagine him demonstrating. And the radio? Olivia wept. I heard Great Uncle Stephen take a long drag on his cigarette. It was there, all right. And it was still on. Number 2. My teddy bears. I was the last in a long line of grandkids on both sides of the family. No one has ever said as much, but I'm pretty sure I was an oops baby. The result of one too many glasses of wine and a couple over 40 who thought unplanned pregnancy were just for teenagers. Oops. By the time I came along, both of my grandmothers had already passed, and my grandfathers were elderly and lived in different states. Trying to coordinate travel plans for a family of 5, including an infant, was difficult on a budget, and neither of my grandpas were up to frequent trips, so visits were rare and spaced out over long periods. Still, both of my parents wanted me to have a relationship with them, so we'd trade phone calls so they could hear my nonsensical baby babble. They'd write me letters for Mom and Dad to read to me, and they'd get crayon scribbles in return. When I was 3, they both started to experience declines in health. First, my maternal grandpa, and then my paternal one. Fearing the worst, Mom purchased a pair of teddy bears, the kind that had recorders in them, so you could record a message that would play when the bear was hugged, and made sure to get a message saved from both. My mom's father died when I was 4. A few days after his funeral, I was given a white teddy bear with bright blue eyes that twinkled from beneath a plaid flat cap and a green sweater. When I gave it a squeeze, I heard my grandpa's slightly muffled voice from its stomach. I love you, Sadie. 2 years later, after Dad's father passed, I got the other one. It was a slate gray color, and the stitching on his face gave him a rather serious expression for a stuffed animal. A pair of red suspenders held up his tan trousers. I fell asleep hugging it, and my dad told me some years later, with tears in his eyes, that randomly throughout that night he kept hearing Grandpop's voice coming from my room. I love you, Sadie. I named my white bear Fran and my gray bear Jock, and I put them on a shelf above my bed, where they sat throughout my childhood. Honestly, I didn't give them much thought. They had become fixtures of my room, the same way the lamp and dresser were. Every now and then I'd come home from school to find one of my parents standing beside my bed, looking up at the bears, or giving them a little squeeze. Even as time passed, they still recited their single phrase without fail. Aside from those instances, though, Fran and Jock were little more than dust collectors from my childhood. When I went away to college, the two didn't make the cut and were left behind while I made my way out into the world for the first time. I think my parents were a little disappointed that I wasn't more sentimental over the teddies, but memories I had of my grandpa's were hazy at best, and I didn't have the same emotional connection that they did. When Mom gently asked about whether I would like them when I moved into my first apartment, I told her no, they were probably better off with her. "Okay," she said. "Well, they'll be here if you change your mind." I was pretty confident that I would. The next time I went back to my parents' house was to house sit, while Dad took Mom on their long-awaited vacation out west. He had been promising her that they'd go for over 30 years, and they were both buzzing with excitement. In typical Mom fashion, she was also very nervous. "You remember where all the financial documents are, in case anything happens to us, right?" she asked from the back seat at least 6 times on the drive to the airport. "Yes, and the white bin under your bed. And the wills? Fireproof lockbox in the back of your closet. And the—" "I think she's got it, hon," Dad said, reaching back to give her knee a squeeze. Mom sighed and sat back. "Just call if you need anything." "I'll be fine, don't worry, you're only going for a week." "Well, a lot can happen in a week," she said. I grinned at her in the rearview mirror, unconcerned, and she made a face at me, but seemed to relax. After I dropped them off, I drove back to their place and started to make myself at home again. I tossed my suitcase on my bed and went to the kitchen to make some dinner and catch up on one of my shows. It had been a while since I'd had a true, completely free week all to myself, and I planned to take full advantage of it. After I ate, I kicked up my feet, stretched out, and commenced lazy lump mode. I managed to get almost 3 episodes in before I started to nod off. I checked the clock over the TV and it sighed. It was only just after 11. Was I really turning into an old, early-to-bed woman already? The horror. I rolled off the couch and shut off the TV and all the lights, plunging the house into a deep darkness. Even in the inky black, I didn't feel even a twinge of nervousness. I'd grown up in this house. I knew it like the back of my hand, and all of its creaks and groans were almost comforting. I made my way to my room and flipped on the light. It had been at least 5 years since I'd lived there, but my parents hadn't done much to change my room, except store a few bits and bobs in the closet. They said it was so I'd know that I'd always have a place with them. I thought it was because changing it would make the fact that I was out for good more real. Whatever the reason, I appreciated the familiarity. As I started to unpack my bag, my eye was drawn to the shelf over my bed. Fran and Jock, ever vigilant, were sitting in the same spots they had occupied for most of my life. I don't know why, but I couldn't help but smile and reach out to them. I took Fran down first and gave his little cap a tweak before squeezing him around his stomach. "I love you, Sadie," Grandpa said. After putting Fran back, I did the same to Jock, who stared up at me with his usual sternness even as I plucked one red suspender. "I love you, Sadie," Grandpop said. It was the first time that I'd listened to them in a while. Even if they didn't resonate as deeply with me as they did my parents, I was glad to find that their recordings still worked. A quick trip to the bathroom and a change into my PJs later, I was in bed and quickly falling asleep. I can't say exactly what woke me. A nightmare, I figured, given that my heart was beating quickly, but I couldn't remember any detail. I took a deep breath and rolled over, already falling half asleep again, and found myself face to face with a dark figure on the pillow beside me. I yelped and sat up, grabbing my phone, the near source of light, and shined it towards my bed. Fran was laying on his side beside me. I let out a small chuckle and gave myself a little shake to dismiss the lingering fright that I had caused and picked him up. "Did you fall off the shelf?" I asked him. I must have put him back too close to the edge earlier, and gravity had done its duty. I gave Fran a gentle squeeze. "Get out." I stared down at the bear and blinked once, very slowly. I must be more sleepy than I realized, I thought. I was hearing things. To prove to myself that it had been just my imagination, I squeezed him again. Get out. It was still Grandpa's voice, but instead of the soft warmth that it always had, it sounded cold and menacing. I threw Fran across the room where he hit the wall. From over my head, I heard Grandpop's more gravelly voice. Get out. I whipped around and looked up at Jock. He was sitting in the same place as always, but now he was turning towards the door instead of facing forwards. Had I put him down like that? I couldn't quite remember. Get out! Grandpa's voice came from Fran again, much louder this time. Get out! Grandpa echoed from Jock. The two went back and forth, their voices getting louder and louder until I slapped my hands over my ears and leapt from my bed. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck behind my fear-tangled tongue. I stumbled across my dark room, chased by my long-dead grandfather's voices. I know you're down there, Jock shouted with Grandpop's voice. I froze. Down there? Down under the shelf? I glanced over my shoulder at the gray bear, staring silently down from over my bed. I had to get out of my room. I had to get out of this house. I yanked open my door. I see you, Fran said in Grandpa's voice. I was halfway out into the hall, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know what was happening. Was I going crazy? Was I dreaming? All I knew that my two childhood toys were screaming threats at me, and I had to get away from them. I turned towards the stairs. You take one more step, I'll make sure it's your last, Jock bellowed. Get out, Fran roared. From somewhere downstairs, a step creaked. Someone else was in the house. They weren't yelling at me at all. I realized with a very strange mix of confusing relief and newly formed horror that they were yelling at the intruder who was making their way up the stairs towards me. Get out! My grandfathers howled together. Footsteps clamored across the wood floor downstairs. Something fell over in the living room with a loud crash and again in the kitchen, before the back door slammed against the counter as it was thrown open and a car engine rumbled to life. Somehow, I regained my wits enough to run to my parents' room and look out the window to the driveway below. An SUV was peeling backwards out into the street. It slammed into the neighbor's mailbox, righted itself, and then screeched off into the night. A heavy quiet had fallen over the house again. After waiting a few long and tense minutes, I crept back across the hall and peeked into my room. Fran and Jock were right where I'd left them, both completely silent now. When they stayed that way, I hesitantly approached Fran, who was lying on his side with his flat little cap beside him. I picked him up and, with trembling fingers, squeezed his stomach. I love you, Sadie, Grandpa said warmly. I put his cap back on his head and gently put him back on the shelf beside Jock, and then backed out of the room, watching them the whole time with wide eyes. As I rounded the corner, heading downstairs to the phone, I heard Grandpop's voice trailing after me. I love you, Sadie. The police arrived a bit later, following my frantic call to 911. I filed a report, leaving out the bit about my talking bears, and allowed them to collect whatever evidence that they could. Every so often, I found myself glancing at the stairs, almost like I was expecting a repeat of whatever had just happened. It never came, and the cops wrapped it up, leaving me alone again. When I called my parents to tell them about the break-in, they immediately wanted to rush home, but I assured them that there was no need. Really? I said. I don't think I have anything to worry about. We could be on the next plane, Mom insisted. No, I'm okay. Whoever that guy was, I'm pretty sure he won't be back. It took a few more go-arounds, but I eventually convinced them that I was safe. And I felt it too, for the most part. After the initial shock had worn off and I'd had time to process what had happened, I really was okay. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't tell anyone what had happened without sounding crazy. But I knew it had been real, and I knew, as long as I had Fran and Jock sitting on the shelf above my bed, that I could sleep easy. A few days later, the cops did find the guy who broke in. He was a co-worker of my dad's who had overheard that he'd be out of town. He thought the house would be empty and easy pickings. When he tried to tell them about the two crazy old guys upstairs and their violent threats, they just rolled their eyes and laughed at him. He was very surprised to hear that only a 22-year-old woman had been in the house during his botched burglary attempt. When I returned home to my apartment a week later, Fran and Jock came with me. I keep them on the TV stand in the living room now, where they have a full view of the front door. Whenever I start to feel a bit anxious about being alone, I'll give each bear a little squeeze and smile as they speak. I love you, Sadie. And now I respond, I love you both too. And there it is. All I have for this time. Thanks for visiting. If you enjoyed the content, please take a moment to like the video and consider subscribing. It really helps out the channel, only takes a second, and it's completely free. If you have a story or a paranormal experience that you'd like to see related here, just send an email to the address pinned in the comments down below. Let me know how you'd like to be credited for your story, or if you'd simply like to remain anonymous. Either way, I'll be sure and respect your wishes. So thanks again. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Biker out.